So we left off, we were talking about adaptive immunity, talking about the body's response to cellular invasion, if you will. Any questions about that material? We had left off, we had mentioned positive and negative selection for T cells and B cells. We had talked about how the variety in the genes leads to the variety in the types of T cells and B cells we have. Okay then. Today we're going to talk about host-microbe interactions. This is chapter 17 in your book. Basically how the body reacts to the microbes that it encounters. If you think about it, every day, every action that we do, we come into contact with bacteria and microbes. Just breathing, you breathe in microbes. The more people that are in a room, the more bacteria that are in the air. So that increases your likelihood of breathing in microbes. Microbes are all over our food. Anything we eat pretty much is going to have microbes on it. Of course, you can cook your food and kill the microbes that are there, but any fresh food probably is going to have microbes in it. Our milk has microbes in it. Our yogurt, our dairy products, our juices that have been pasteurized still have microbes in them. Anything and everything we touch, really, if you think about it, has bacteria on it. The hospital is supposed to be one of the cleanest environments you can go into, really. If you think about it, probably not so much. Sure, areas are clean and kept sterile, but there are probably a lot of other areas that have bacteria that pose risk, if you will. Most of the microbes that we come in contact with are generally harmless. They're not going to cause any ill. We come in contact with them regularly. But a few of them do. And those that do cause illness are pathogens. And a pathogen is a microbe then that's going to cause damage to the body. It's either going to invade tissues or it's going to produce toxins that are going to cause damage to cells. Pathogens are very specific with their mode of infection, and we'll talk about some of them, and we have already earlier in the semester. Before we get into discussing how the pathogens inhabit the body, let's talk a little bit about how we sort of keep them away from us, at least from infecting the body. We've talked about it a little bit in chapter 15 when we talked about our normal microbiota. But we're going to cover these guys again here. These are the bacteria that are living on our skin, living in our intestines, our normal flora, if you will, and they actually outnumber our body cells. There's a delicate balancing act between our normal microbiota and the bacteria that are in our environment. And if our normal microbiota become depressed for some reason, it can give other environmental bacteria a chance to cause infection. Weakness in our immune system can allow some of our normal microbiota to become pathogenic. When we talk about normal microbiota, we're referring to the populations that are routinely found on the body. And you have your resident normal microbiota. And these are the bacteria that are generally always there. But you can also have microbiota that are transient. So if you travel to a new environment, you may become inhabited by a different microbe that might stay with you while you're in that environment, but then when you come home, maybe it can't survive here for whatever reason, or it just isn't. So it no longer becomes part of your microbiota. We've talked about the protective role that these guys serve. When our microbiota is suppressed, other pathogens can become harmful or may even colonize our body. We see this when we take antibiotics. Antibiotics can have an effect on our intestinal microbiota, suppressing them and allowing for other microbes that might be there to take hold and cause infection that otherwise would not be able to. We've mentioned in the past how our microbiota protect us. They competitively inhibit colonization. Their presence, their simple fact that they're there, can prevent other bacteria from adhering to the cells. They cover binding sites that will inhibit that from happening. They consume the nutrients that might be in the environment, preventing other bacteria from inhabiting. They produce toxins that can serve to limit or inhibit the growth of pathogens. And as we mentioned last time in chapter 17 or 15, when we were talking about these guys, they help prime our immune system. Anytime you get a cut, you get introduced to some of your normal microbiota. In fact, it is believed that you need to have some regular exposure to to your normal microbiota in order to develop immunities, if you will, so that you don't have immune responses to microbes that aren't going to cause you illness. It's the hygiene hypothesis. You might have heard of this, where if you are not exposed on a regular basis as a child to normal bacteria, then you develop allergies to things that normally you wouldn't have allergies to. So that there is some good, if you will, in being exposed to regular microbes on a regular basis, because you develop an immunity to them. And remember we talked about T cells, and how T cells, when they're being presented with an antigen, sometimes ignore those antigens. Well, you can see why they might want to do that. If it's an antigen from a microbe that's part of your oral hygiene or part of your gut, you don't want to necessarily react to these guys every time you encounter them, because they're not going to cause you any ill. They're part of your normal microbiota. So regular exposure to these guys serves to suppress your immune response to them. And that's a good thing, because you don't want to overreact every time you get exposed to a bacterium. The other thing that we can note about our microbiota is that it can change throughout our lifetime. Depending on your diet, mentioned location, even depending on your weight. Studies have shown that heavier people have a different microbiota community than leaner people. So what about the principles of infectious disease? Well, what are the things that we have to know to identify disease has occurred? Well, first, colonization has to occur. When we say colonization, the microbe has to become established. It has to adhere to cells and then start growing, start multiplying. Then, if that microbe is parasitic, we have what is called an infection. Okay, so let's go back to that word I just used, parasitic. Hopefully you're somewhat familiar with the notion of symbiosis, and your book covers it briefly in a small little box. But there's three kinds of symbiosis, if you will. There's commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. Commensalism and mutualism, mutualism means either of them benefit. Commensalism means one benefits, the other doesn't. Parasitism or parasites, they benefit, but the host doesn't. And all the microbes that we're talking about that cause infection really could be classified then as parasites. The microbes that colonize our bodies are either mutualistic or commensalistic, easy for me to say. And we're not going to really dwell on them much. We're going to talk about those that cause infection, those that are parasitic. So if you have an infection, you can have what is called an inapparent or a subclinical infection. This is one where there are no signs of symptoms. The symptoms do not appear. Or they might be mild and they go unnoticed. On the other hand, an infectious disease is going to be one where you can see the signs, you can see the symptoms. There is noticeable impairment of bodily function. When we talk about microbes that cause infections, there are those microbes that we can identify as being primary infectors, if you will. A primary infection is one that's going to happen initially and can often lead to a secondary infection. A secondary infection happens because the primary infection has weakened the immune response. The immune response is busy dealing with this primary infection, and so now a secondary microbe can come along and cause illness. Pathogenicity. With regards to these primary and these secondary pathogens, these primary and secondary infections here, a primary pathogen then is one that is going to make a healthy person sick. So an otherwise healthy individual can succumb to a primary infection. A secondary pathogen then causes a secondary infection is one that's going to take advantage of the compromised immune system. And it is not uncommon for the secondary pathogen to be part of your normal microbiota. So just because your normal microbiota doesn't make you sick, doesn't mean it can't make you sick. If your immune system becomes depressed because of a primary infection, then a secondary infection can develop via one of those microbes that's part of your normal microbiota. We call these guys opportunistic pathogens. Another term I'll throw in here with regards to pathogenicity, virulence. And this is going to refer to the degree of pathogenicity. So when we think about what that means, the degree of pathogenicity, you can think about this population in this room. Let's say there's 100 people here, okay? Virulence is going to refer to both the proportion of people that become infected and the severity of the symptoms of those people that are infected. So we can have, say, of this room, 20 people come down with a very light case of the flu and say that it's probably not very virulent. But then if 50 people came down with a disease, half the population, and there were vomiting and there was diarrhea, then we would describe that microbe as having high virulence. So virulence has to do with the number of individuals that succumb and the symptoms that they have. Talk about contagious disease. Okay, contagious disease is going to be one then that can be spread from one host to another. Communicable.